He had lived alone for 8 years, speaking only to his horses and the wind. But when 10 Apache women appeared at his gate that stormy night, begging for shelter, Tobias Redmond would face the hardest choice of his life. The men hunting them were already close, enough to smell the smoke from his chimney. The rain hammered against the wooden shutters like bullets, each drop a reminder of why decent folks stayed indoors when nature turned violent. Tobias sat by his fireplace, mending a bridle that had seen better days, when the knocking started. It was not the polite tap of a neighbor. This was desperate, urgent, the sound of people who had nowhere else to go. He froze, leather still in his hands. Nobody came to his ranch, not anymore. Not since he'd made it clear that Tobias Redmond wanted nothing to do with the world. Beyond his fence line, the knocking came again, harder this time, accompanied by voices speaking in a language he recognized but hadn't heard in years. Apache. His blood turned cold. The last time he'd heard that tongue, his wife and daughter were still breathing. The last time strangers had come to his door in the night, he buried everything he loved in the morning. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle mounted above the mantel. Muscle memory from nights when sleep came with one eye open. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the tone of the voices, not were cries or demands, but something that sounded almost like pleading. Maybe it was the way the wind carried their words, broken and desperate. Or maybe it was the realization that warriors didn't usually announce themselves by knocking. He approached the heavy oak door, each step measured and careful. Through the thick wood, he could hear them more clearly now. Women's voices, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. One voice rose above the others, speaking English with an accent that made each word sound like it had been carved from stone. "Please, we know you are there. We need shelter, just for tonight." Tobias pressed his palm against the door, feeling the vibration of their voices through the wood. 8 years of solitude had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct screamed danger, not from the women themselves, but from whatever had driven them to his door in the middle of a storm that could kill a man in minutes. He thought of Sarah, how she used to scold him for his suspicion of strangers, how she'd say that kindness was the only thing that separated them from the animals. But Sarah was dead, and kindness had died with her on a morning when he trusted the wrong people. The voice came again, closer now, as if the speaker had pressed her face against the wood. "They are coming. If you do not help us, we will die out here. And when they find our bodies at your gate, you will die too." Tobias's hand hovered over the iron bar that secured his door. In 8 years, he had never removed it for anyone, but something in that voice of certainty that made his stomach drop told him that tonight, everything was about to change. Somewhere in the darkness beyond his ranch, riders were closing in, and once they arrived, there would be no going back to the life he built in the shadows. The iron bar felt heavier than it should have when Tobias finally lifted it from its brackets, as if 8 years of rust and fear fought against his decision. But the desperation in that woman's voice had cut through his defenses like a blade through paper. The door creaked open, revealing a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 10 Apache women stood huddled on his porch, their traditional dress torn and muddied. Some bore wounds that painted dark stains against the wet fabric. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, clutching a bundle that moved slightly, a baby, barely breathing in the cold. The oldest had silver threading through her black hair and eyes that had seen too much death. But it was the woman who had spoken through the door that commanded his attention. She stood slightly apart from the others, her chin raised despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Blood trickled from a cut above her left eye, and her dress was torn at the shoulder, but her gaze held his without flinching. "I am Iana," she said, her English careful but clear. "These are my sisters, my daughters, my people. We have been running for 3 days." Tobias opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. Questions crowded his mind. Where they'd come from, why they were alone, what kind of men were chasing them. But the sight of the baby's pale lips stopped his words. Some things mattered more than answers. "Come in," he heard himself say, stepping back from the doorway. Quickly, they moved like shadows, filing past him into the warmth of his main room. Tobias had forgotten how small his home felt with other people in it. For 8 years it had been his fortress, his refuge from a world that had taken everything. Now it seemed to shrink around these women, who brought with them the smell of rain and fear, and something else, the metallic scent of blood that wasn't entirely their own. Iana was the last to enter. As she passed him, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The soldiers who hunt us, they are not far behind. Maybe an hour, maybe less. They will not stop until every one of us is dead." Tobias closed the door and slid the bar back into place, knowing it was probably useless now. His sanctuary had been breached, not by force, but by choice, and there would be consequences. There always were. "Why?" he asked, turning to face Iana. "Why are they hunting you?" Her dark eyes found his, and in them, he saw a familiar pain, the look of someone who had lost everything and lived to tell about it. "Because we ran instead of dying quietly," she said. "Because we chose to live when they expected us to accept death. Because some of us fought back when they burned our village and killed our men." The baby in the young woman's arms made a weak sound, and Iana's jaw tightened. "And because one of their officers will not see morning if we live to tell what he did to my youngest sister." Tobias felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd known soldiers like that, men who wore uniforms but had forgotten what honor meant, men who took what they wanted and killed anyone who might speak of it later. "How many are coming?" he asked. 8, maybe 10, led by a captain named Morrison. "He has been hunting Apache villages for months, claiming we are hostile. But his real enemy is anyone who might report what kind of man he truly is." Tobias moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters at the storm-lashed darkness beyond his fence. Nothing moved that he could see, but that meant little. Professional killers knew how to move unseen, especially when they thought their prey was trapped. He turned back to the women, who were now clustered near his fireplace. Some tended to wounds while others comforted the youngest among them. They looked like survivors, not warriors. But he'd learned long ago that survival sometimes required a person to become something they'd never planned to be. "There's a cellar beneath the kitchen," he said to Iana. "Stone walls, hidden entrance. It might hold all of you, but it'll be cramped." She shook her head slowly. "If they search and find us, you die with us. If they find an empty house with signs that people were here, they might believe you were not involved. We will not make you an enemy of the United States Army." Tobias almost laughed. 8 years too late for that conversation, lady. I became their enemy the day I decided to live past what they did to my family. The only question now is whether we run or whether we make them pay for coming here. Something flickered in Iana's eyes, surprise, recognition, maybe even hope. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, and with it, the cover that had protected them. In the distance, barely audible over the dying wind, came the sound of horses moving through mud and the low voices of men who thought they had their prey cornered. The sound of approaching horses cut through the storm like a death sentence. Tobias moved with the efficiency of a man who had survived by thinking 3 steps ahead, grabbing his rifle and a box of ammunition from a cabinet. But as he turned back to the women, he saw something that stopped him cold. Iana was no longer the desperate refugee who had begged at his door. She stood differently now, her posture straight and commanding, and in her hands was a knife that gleamed with more than just firelight. The other women had transformed too, some clutching weapons they'd hidden beneath their torn dresses, others positioning themselves with the practiced ease of people who had fought before. "You are not helpless," Tobias said, understanding flooding through him. "We never were," Iana replied, her voice carrying a hardness that matched the steel in her grip. "But sometimes it is better to let men think what they wish to think. Captain Morrison believes he is hunting frightened women who will cower and beg. He is about to learn otherwise." The youngest woman with the baby moved toward the back of the house without being told, and the others followed her. They knew what they were doing, had planned for this moment. Tobias realized he wasn't sheltering helpless refugees. He was harboring warriors who had been playing a longer game than he'd understood. "How many men have you killed?" he asked Iana directly. Her dark eyes met his without shame. enough to know that Morrison's soldiers are not the first to underestimate Apache women. They will not be the last, but they may be the most surprised. Outside, the voices grew clearer as men called to each other through the rain, coordinating their approach. Tobias could make out at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more professional soldiers, but operating in territory they didn't understand, hunting prey they had completely misjudged. The cellar, Tobias said again, but Iana shook her head. We run now, and they follow us forever. We hide, and they search until they find us. But if we end this here, tonight, the hunting stops. Tobias felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years, the cold clarity. That came before violence, when survival stripped away everything except what needed to be done. These women hadn't come to his ranch by accident. They'd chosen this ground, this night, this storm. They brought their war to his doorstep because they knew exactly what kind of man he used to be. What do you need from me? He asked. Iana's smile was as sharp as her blade. Captain Morrison expects to find helpless women. Instead, he will find us. But when his men see a white rancher fighting alongside Apache, they will hesitate. That hesitation will cost them everything. A horse nickered close to the house, and heavy boots splashed through the mud outside. Someone was moving around the building, checking for exits, planning their assault. In minutes, they would be inside, expecting to find cowering victims. Tobias checked his rifle, ensuring a round was chambered. Sarah's voice whispered in his memory, reminding him that kindness was what separated them from animals. But kindness, he was learning, sometimes wore the face of violence when it was the only thing standing between innocence and evil. There is something else, Iana said quietly. When this is over, if we survive, you cannot stay here. Morrison's death will bring questions, investigations. They will come looking for answers. Tobias nodded. He'd known at the moment he'd opened his door. 8 years of peace was ending tonight, but maybe that was how it was supposed to be. Maybe some men weren't meant to hide from the world forever. Outside, a voice rang through the storm, commanding, arrogant, certain of victory. I know you're in there. Come out now and we'll make this quick. Captain Morrison had arrived, and he was about to discover that some hunts end with the hunter becoming the prey. Tobias positioned himself at the front window, while Iana and 3 other women spread throughout the main room, invisible in the shadows cast by the dying fire. The remaining women had melted into the back of the house, creating multiple lines of defense. The front door exploded inward as Morrison kicked it open, his rifle raised and ready. But instead of finding cowering women, he found himself staring down the barrel of Tobias's Winchester. For a split second, confusion flickered across the captain's face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. That second of hesitation was all Iana needed. A mirror flashed in the firelight, reflecting a signal to positions throughout the house. The storm that had hidden the soldiers' approach now muffled the sounds of what followed, the whisper of blades finding their targets, the muffled grunts of men who died before they could scream, the wet sounds of justice being served with Apache steel. Morrison's eyes widened as he understood he'd walked into a trap, but understanding came too late. Tobias's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Iana appeared behind the captain like a shadow given form. This is for my sister, she whispered in Morrison's ear, her blade sliding between his ribs with surgical precision. Morrison dropped his rifle, his hands clutching at the wound, but Iana wasn't finished. She wanted him to see her face, to know who had brought him justice. And this is for every woman you thought was too weak to fight back. But as Morrison fell, a new sound reached them through the storm. More horses, more voices. Morrison hadn't come alone after all. Somewhere in the darkness, reinforcements were approaching, and the real battle was just beginning. The sound of approaching reinforcements turned Tobias's blood to ice. Through the broken doorway, he could see torch flames dancing in the darkness at least a dozen riders, maybe more. Morrison had been the advance party, not the main force. The real army was just arriving. Iana pulled her blade free from Morrison's chest, her face grim. Around the house, her women appeared from the shadows like ghosts, each confirming what Tobias already knew. Morrison's original squad was dead, but their victory had lasted exactly 30 seconds. How many? Iana asked the woman who materialized beside her. 15 riders, maybe 20. They heard the fighting. They know something went wrong. Tobias felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Fight and die, or surrender and die slower. But as he looked at these women, he realized there might be a third option, one that required him to become the man he used to be before grief had turned him into a hermit. The storm cellar, he said quickly. Not to hide, to survive what comes next. Iana shook her head. We cannot run from this many. They will hunt us across 3 territories. We're not running, Tobias replied, moving toward a cabinet he hadn't opened in 8 years. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were things he'd hoped never to touch again. Dynamite, fuses the tools of a man who'd once demolished mountainsides to build railroads. My ranch sits on a hill, he explained, his hands working automatically to prepare charges. Natural drainage runs down both sides. When the spring floods come, all that water has to go somewhere. Understanding dawned in Iana's eyes. The dam. Tobias nodded. I built it to control flooding, but take it out during a storm like this. He gestured toward the approaching torches. That valley fills with 10 feet of water in minutes. Anyone caught down there dies, Iana finished. But we would be destroying your home, your land. Tobias looked around the cabin that had been his prison, then at Morrison's body cooling on his floor. Home wasn't a place anymore. It was a choice. Some things matter more than property, he said, echoing words Sarah used to speak. Outside, the voices were getting closer, orders being shouted. Someone had found Morrison's body by now. Lieutenant Morrison is dead, a voice bellowed. Surrender now, or we burn you out. Iana looked at Tobias, her expression unreadable. If we do this, there's no going back. You will be a wanted man for the rest of your life. Tobias shouldered his rifle and picked up the prepared charges. Lady, I've been a dead man for 8 years. Tonight, I'm choosing to live again. But as they prepared to leave through the back entrance, a new sound stopped them cold. The cry of a baby, not the one in their arms, but another, somewhere out in the storm. One of the soldiers had brought a child, and the hardest choices are the ones that test how far a man will go to save the people who matter most. The cry of that distant baby changed everything. Tobias froze, the dynamite suddenly feeling like lead in his hands. Iana grabbed his arm. It could be a trick, but Tobias shook his head. He knew the sound of genuine terror. Someone out there, probably one of Morrison's men, had brought their child on what they'd expected to be a simple murder mission. We can't blow the dam, he said quietly, not with a baby down there. Then we all die, one of the other women hissed. My daughter's life matters as much as that one. She was right, and Tobias knew it. But some lines, once crossed, change a man forever. There's another way, he said, setting down the explosives. Harder, more dangerous, but it keeps everyone breathing. We make them think we're trapped, make them overconfident. He moved to another cabinet, this one containing items that spoke to a different kind of warfare. Caltrops, tripwires, bear traps that had never seen a bear. I turned this place into a fortress because I was afraid of dying. Tonight, we're going to use those defenses to make sure other people live. The plan was simple and brutal. Iana and for women would create a loud distraction at the front of the house to draw the assault team. Meanwhile, Tobias and the remaining women would circle around through terrain only he knew, targeting the reserve force and, hopefully, getting that baby to safety. If this goes wrong, Iana said, Morrison's death will mean nothing. And if we do nothing, Tobias replied, that baby out there dies for its father's crimes, and you all die for the crime of wanting to live. Sometimes the only choice is between bad and worse. The baby's cry came again, weaker now. Move, he whispered. As Iana's team took positions, Tobias led the others into the storm, but as they crept through the darkness, he realized he'd made a critical error. The baby wasn't with the reserve force. It was much closer, somewhere in the crossfire. The cries were coming from a military supply wagon positioned between the house and the soldiers' main camp. Beside it, A woman hunched over something small, not a soldier's wife, but a camp follower, trapped. From the house came the sound of Iana's distraction gunshots and shouting. It was working. Soldiers moved toward the house, leaving the supply area lightly guarded by 3 men. Tobias rose from cover and walked directly toward the wagon, his rifle held low. "Easy, soldier," he called out with calm authority. "Lieutenant Morrison sent me to secure the civilians." The lie bought him seconds. By the time the nearest guard realized his mistake, Tobias was too close. "You're not Army," the soldier said. "No," Tobias agreed and struck the man across the temple with his rifle butt. He dropped silently into the mud. The woman with the baby looked up, terror in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt my baby. Neither of you has done anything wrong," Tobias said quietly. "My name is Mary Hendricks. I cook for the men. Captain Morrison said it would be safe." Morrison had lied to his own people. "Mary, I'm going to get you out of here," Tobias said. "When the shooting gets worse, run for that grove of trees and follow the creek downstream. It leads to a trading post. Tell them Tobias Redmond sent you." Before he could say more, the other guards spotted him. One shouted a warning, but the Apache women Tobias had left in position were already moving, emerging from the darkness like vengeful spirits. The fight was brief and decisive. Within minutes, the supply area was secure, and Mary Hendricks was running into the night with her baby, disappearing into the safety of the storm. But their victory was short-lived. From the direction of the house came a new sound, silence, and rising above the dying storm, a new voice called out with cold authority. "This is Colonel Bradley, United States Army. You are surrounded by a full company of soldiers. Surrender now, or we will burn you out and hang the survivors." Morrison hadn't been the real leader after all. A much more dangerous enemy had been watching, waiting, letting others die while he positioned his forces for the killing blow. Colonel Bradley's voice carried the confidence of a man who held all the cards. Torches spread out in a wide circle, revealing a full military operation. Morrison had been the bait, and they had walked straight into the trap. But then Tobias heard something that changed everything. Iana's voice, calling from the house. "Tobias, we have Bradley's son." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Bradley's voice came again, laced with a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Release the boy, and we can discuss terms." "There are no terms," Iana shouted back. "Only justice." Tobias made his way back to the house to find a scene he couldn't have imagined. Iana stood behind a young man in a lieutenant's uniform, her knife pressed to his throat. The boy, who had Bradley's eyes, showed only terror. "He came through the back," Iana explained quietly. "Thought he was being clever." Tobias studied the boy's face. "Lieutenant Bradley, did you know what Morrison was really doing to those villages?" The young man's eyes flickered, understanding finally dawning. I thought we were suppressing hostile Indians. Father said they were raiders." "Your father lied," Iana said softly. "Peaceful Indians don't justify military budgets, do they?" Outside, Bradley's voice came again, more desperate. "I have 60 men surrounding this house. Release my son, and I'll give you safe passage." Tobias looked at the young lieutenant and saw genuine shock and growing horror as the boy began to understand what he'd been a part of. "There's another way," Tobias said to Iana, "one that doesn't require his death." "He is guilty by association," she replied. "No," Tobias said, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "But his testimony might convict his father." "You want me to betray my father?" the young lieutenant whispered. "I want you to tell the truth," Tobias replied. Before anyone could respond, a new sound cut through the night. Horses approaching at a full gallop, with orders shouted that didn't come from Bradley's men. Through the broken door, Tobias saw new torches carried by riders in different uniforms, federal marshals. Someone had been watching Bradley's operations, and tonight's massacre had finally drawn official attention. As understanding dawned, Tobias realized they might all survive, but survival would come with a price. The truth would have to be told. The young lieutenant looked from his captors to the approaching marshals, then at his own reflection in the blade still at his throat. "What do you need me to say?" he whispered. Dawn broke 6 hours later, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The federal investigators had listened to Lieutenant Bradley's testimony with growing horror, documenting crimes that reached far beyond Morrison's unit. Colonel Bradley was led away in chains, his career destroyed by his own son's courage. The surviving Apache women were granted federal protection and compensation for their losses, though no money could restore their families. Tobias stood in the doorway of his ruined home, watching Iana prepare to leave with her people. The 2 babies they'd saved had survived the night, though the cost in other lives had been terrible. "Where will you go?" he asked Iana. "North, to relatives who escaped Bradley's campaign. We will rebuild, but not here. This place holds too much blood now." She paused, studying his face. "What about you? Your home is destroyed. Your solitude ended." Tobias nodded. She was right. The hermit who'd hidden from the world was gone, replaced by someone who'd remembered that some things were worth fighting for, worth living for. "I think I'll head west," he said. "Find some place that needs a man who knows how to build things and isn't afraid to defend them." Iana smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "That cook, Mary Hendricks, she will need protection until she reaches her family in Denver. The trail is dangerous for a woman alone with a baby." Tobias understood. His first act as a man reborn wouldn't be running toward a new life, but ensuring another reached her safely. As the Apache women rode north toward hope and Tobias prepared to ride west toward redemption, the sun climbed higher over a ranch that had seen too much death and just enough justice. The end of one story was simply the beginning of another, and sometimes a man who thought he was finished with living discovered he was just getting started.